Friends, today I want to share with you a story on St. John the Forerunner. But since St. John the Forerunner is anticipated by Elijah, and we are in a different context where we can do a few different things, I'm going to share with you a never before heard story from the cutting room floor on Elijah himself. This story comes from the book of Kings when Elijah is sent back down from Zarephath to confront Ahab after the end of that famous drought. And it starts this way. My, how the land had changed. The country had been struggling when Elijah passed through 3 years ago. Now it was stricken. The bones of animals shone on the hillsides. The grass had withered and fallen apart and now was dust. The trees were skeletons. The sky was like the path of an army. In Samaria, in the palace of Ahab, the scene was dire. There was little food and so little water they licked the moisture from their cups and sucked on the shade. Every day, more servants died, more peasants, until their bodies made piles outside the city walls, and even the prophets of Baal sulked in the temple, too tired to move. At last, Ahab called Obadiah, and Obadiah came. The two men stood, appraising the land. Go through the country, Ahab determined, to all the springs and valleys. We may find grass and save some of the horses and mules. We may spare some of the animals. He glanced at the horizon. It was war he thought of chariots and cavalries. The land was vulnerable. When the famine ended, the armies would come. All right, Obadiah panted. I'll check the northern wadis. They were empty, of course. What else could he do? They divided the land and went separate ways. Obadiah was alone on the road. The land was like a stone and Obadiah an insect when, not quite believing what he saw, Obadiah saw a figure on the road. Someone was coming toward him at speed. He would have wondered who it was, except that only one man traveled like that. Obadiah gaped. The sun sucked the water from his mouth and he fell on his face. In a minute, the big square feet of Elijah were in front of him. Is it you, Lord Elijah? Obadiah gasped. Is it really you? It is, came the voice Obadiah remembered. Get on up. Obadiah stood. Elijah's face was awful and serious. Go to your Lord, tell him I'm back, he said. At once the joy was gone from the meeting, and it was only the wind and the blistering sun. Obadiah shook his head. Elijah, he said, don't you know that Ahab has hounded the country looking for you? If a nation said no, they had not seen you, he made them swear it. If I say I've seen you and you vanish, he'll kill me. Don't you know I fed 100 prophets when Jezebel was killing the people of Yahweh? Elijah was calm. I stand in the presence of the Lord of armies, he said. And as he lives, I'll see Ahab today. Go tell him. Obadiah relented. He went and told Ahab. And so the two men met again, alone, in the desert that Israel had become. Elijah stood tall while Ahab approached. Ahab staggered back and forth. When they were a spear's length apart, he stopped. They faced off like soldiers or Western cowboys. All that was needed was a tumbleweed, and there were plenty of those. Ahab took off his helmet. It was the middle of the 9th century BC. To the east, the vast armies of Babylon and Assyria were at it again. In Egypt, the chiefs of Ma stretched out a hand from Bubastis. King Li of Zhou ruled nascent China. In India, philosophers and spirits worked hard on the Vedas, and in the Americas, the Olmecs built statues and pyramids and huge mosaics. And yet here, in the Levant, Elijah and Ahab found themselves at the still point of the turning world. They were in the center of history. What a contrast they were. Elijah was like a wet summer, but Ahab was changed, horn thin with bulging, thirsty, red-rimmed eyes, and his armor didn't fit. You'd never have believed the warrior he'd been. In fact, they were good representatives of the spirits they served. Ahab was a husk. He had everything and possessed none of it. Elijah had nothing. He possessed everything. He was silent while Ahab rubbed his eyes. The king squinted in the glare. "Is it really you?" he said, "troubler of Israel?" Elijah was silent. At their feet, wind spiraled the dust. "I ain't troubled no one," he finally replied, "but you have. You and your fathers abandoned Yahweh and followed the Baals. You brought ruin on your people." Elijah's eyes snapped. He'd seen it firsthand. Ahab did not deny it. Elijah continued. "Call your kingdom and come to Carmel," he said. "Call Israel and all them prophets Jezebel feeds. We'll settle this there." And whether it was because he was desperate, or because he was curious, or because the showdown was inevitable, Ahab did. He called out Israel, and Israel came. From starving towns and thirsty villages they came, carrying their children, leaving the sick in bed, walking by the graves and shrines and altars. They came like skeletons or a river of ghosts to Carmel. Elijah watched them come, and his heart burned. They were idolaters and murderers and practiced occultists. They killed the prophets and burned their children. In other words, they were a fairly representative cross-section of humanity. They tottered uphill like imitations of people. This was Baal's kingdom. This is what he does. Then, out among them, the procession appeared. Purple flags and bronze spears and vampiric chants and fanfare. The prophets of Baal and Asherah had come. Elijah clenched his fists. He turned to the summit while the assembly spiraled up the mountain. Do you know this story? It's famous. It marks the beginning of that generation's deliverance. The people came to the top of Carmel. The prophets of Baal and Asherah were on one side, Elijah on the other, while the people assembled. Elijah searched their faces. Surely he would recognize some of them, but no. They were so disfigured he could not tell. When they were gathered round, he called to them, and his voice was loud on the mountain. "How long you gonna limp between two different opinions?" he shouted. "If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, follow him." No one replied. Elijah outlined the test. "Get 2 bulls for us," he said. "These men," he pointed at the prophets of Baal, "can have their pick and set it on the altar." He stared at the prophets, "But don't light it. I'll do the same. Whichever God answers by fire, he's God." That was straightforward. The people agreed. Elijah said, "Go on now." The prophets of Baal began. They killed and diced up the bull. Blood stank in the air. The prophets began a dance, a wild, gyrating commotion. They circled the altar. "Jezebel," they called. Her name was a cultic chant. "Where is the prince? Jezebel." The prince was not present, evidently. No fire came. Elijah called to them. His face was hard. "Call louder," he said. "Might be he's on the John just now." The prophet scowled. Elijah cupped his hands to his mouth. "Maybe he's traveling." In fact, Baal probably was traveling, though not to Carmel. Baal, or whatever rebel spirit answered to that name, was and remains real. It could have arrived, and that's hugely important. When Ahab finally died, Moab rebelled. Vassal states do that when established kings depart, and Ahab's successor, Azariah, also died, but another son, Jehoram, led a coalition against King Mesha of Moab. They were sustained along the way, and the war looked good until Jehoram besieged Kir Hareseth. There, on the wall, King Mesha played his ace. He sacrificed his son to Chemosh, a local name for Baal. It was, we can say, effective. Something happened. The biblical speaker recalls there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew. 2 Kings 3:7. That was the King Mesha who commissioned the Mesha stela, by the way. He recorded the event on that stone. Chemosh, says the stele, drove Israel out from before me. I'm afraid it's true. So the silence at Carmel was conspicuous. The prophets cut themselves with Phoenician lances and jeweled daggers and spilled blood on the altar, but Baal would not show. Another power was in attendance, the spirit to whom all spirits bow. At last, it was Elijah's turn. He looked at the people. "Gather round," he said. Israel did. There was a pile of rubble on the mountain. A long time ago, so long ago that no living person had seen it, that pile had been an altar to Yahweh. Now it was less than a cairn. Elijah approached it. He sifted there for good stones, and when he found it, he picked it up and said a name. "Reuben," he said, and set it in place. He searched for another. "Simeon." He set that rock on the altar. "Judah." A flash of recognition lit up their faces when they heard the old designations. "Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali." He found a split rock. "Ephraim and Manasseh." Elijah rebuilt the people. He stacked the wood and prepared the bowl, then he did the astonishing thing. "Pour water on that," he said. I wonder if anyone moved. This was a drought. The people had a little water in skins, precious to them. Elijah was about to fill a trench. There must have been some resistance. The water made it hard for wood to burn, but it was primarily wasteful. The trench could hold gallons. "Fill the jars," Elijah said, and the people did. They poured out the dregs of their skins and animal bladders until the drips filled the jars and the jars were poured out. After that, they were filled again and again. Was it most of the water available? Eventually, the trench was filled. The altar was soaked. It shone like gold, and the sun revealed that the time for the offering was at hand. "Get back a ways," Elijah said, before he went and knelt down. "Yahweh," he prayed, "the one who was known to Abraham, Isaac, and to Israel, it's time. Let it be known you are God. I am your servant. This is your command. Answer me," he prayed, "and let them know that you are calling the hearts of your people again." Elijah stood. Some people swore they heard a crackling, like stones knocking together, before the fire roared down and landed on the sacrifice like a hammer onto an anvil.